The headline looked wrong in a way that made your brain pause. Mali and Burkina Faso restrict entry to American citizens. Not issue warning, not review relations, not protest U.S. policy. Restrict entry. Two countries that barely receive American tourists, barely host American companies, barely appear on American travel maps, are suddenly blocking the strongest passport in the world. At first, it felt symbolic, almost ironic, the kind of move you assume will be reversed quietly in a week. But then the details started surfacing. No exceptions were announced, no special categories, no time limits, no diplomatic cushioning. Just a clean rule applied immediately. And what made it even stranger wasn't Washington's reaction. It was Africa's. No panic, no confusion, no fear. Instead, something closer to satisfaction. Which raises the real question. What kind of global system makes a decision this extreme feel emotionally normal? Let's find out. It didn't start in Africa. That's the part most people missed. The first move happened quietly in the United States, buried inside a routine policy update that barely made front-page news. Trump expanded an existing travel ban and added 7 more countries to the list. Not one dramatic announcement, no emergency address. Just a bureaucratic change slipped into a press release. At first glance, it looked like the same old story. Another immigration restriction, another set of countries is labeled as high risk, another moment that would trend for a day and then disappear. But the list itself was strange. It wasn't just one region, it wasn't just one conflict zone. It included Syrians, citizens of Niger, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, and Senegal. Countries with completely different politics, histories, and relationships with the U.S. are all grouped under one category. What connected them wasn't war, or insurgency, or even crime data. It was something simpler. They were all populations the U.S. could restrict without domestic backlash. The justification was even thinner than usual. The White House said the ban applied to foreigners who might intend to threaten Americans, not who had threatened, not those who were suspected, just who might intend to. That single word quietly changed the logic of borders. It moved immigration from a system based on actions to a system based on identity. It didn't matter what you had done. It didn't matter who you were individually. Your passport itself became the risk profile, and nobody protested. There were no mass demonstrations in Washington, no lawsuits that gained traction, no serious media outrage. Because most of the people affected didn't have a political voice inside the U.S. That silence mattered. It told the world something uncomfortable. Entire nationalities can now be filtered out of global movement without needing evidence, explanation, or justification beyond a vague sense of fear. This wasn't a security tool anymore. It was a classification system, a way of sorting humanity into normal travelers and potential threats using nothing but geography. And because this kind of sorting had been happening to African and Middle Eastern countries for decades, most people didn't even recognize it as a new escalation. It felt routine, almost boring, until 2 countries refused to treat it as routine. Instead of complaining, instead of negotiating, instead of asking for exemptions, Mali and Burkina Faso copied it. Same language, same mechanism, same cold logic. They didn't argue about fairness. They didn't issue moral statements. They simply applied the same rule back. Which is why this story suddenly stopped being about immigration and started becoming about power. Because bans are normal when they flow in one direction. They only become shocking when they reverse. And that reversal forces a question nobody was supposed to ask. If the U.S. can define entire populations as potential risks without evidence, why shouldn't others be allowed to do the same? The reason this response felt so blunt is that it wasn't written in the usual diplomatic language. It wasn't shaped by lawyers, policy advisors, or foreign affairs committees. It came from governments that operate on a completely different logic, military regimes. In both Mali and Burkina Faso, the people in charge are not career politicians. They are officers who came to power through coups, not elections. Their political instincts aren't built around public relations or international approval. They're built around command, control, and perception of strength. And in military logic, There is a simple rule: unanswered pressure is weakness. When Trump expanded the travel ban, it wasn't interpreted in Bamako or Ouagadougou as immigration reform. It was read as a symbolic downgrade, a message that their citizens, by default, belong to a category of risk. To a civilian government, that might trigger a protest note, a formal complaint, a negotiation for exemptions. To a military government, it triggers something else entirely: symmetry, not escalation, not retaliation. Symmetry. If a rule is imposed on you without consultation, you impose the same rule back. Not to punish the other side, but to erase the hierarchy embedded in the original action. That's why the counterban had no emotional language, no speeches about dignity, no references to history, no appeals to international law. It was administrative, a mirror image of the US move. And it was designed that way on purpose. Military governments understand something diplomats often avoid admitting: power is psychological before it is practical. You don't need to damage an opponent's economy to challenge their status. You just need to disrupt their assumptions. The US assumed its restrictions would be absorbed quietly, like every previous one, that Africans would complain and move on. Instead, the rule was reflected so cleanly that it became impossible to ignore. The absence of exceptions is what makes this so revealing. Normally, even hostile states carve out special categories: aid workers, business leaders, journalists, diplomats, some form of civilized loophole. Mali and Burkina created none, which tells you the goal was not management. It was discomfort. They wanted the rule to feel exactly how it feels when applied to Africans: unpredictable, impersonal, and based on nothing you personally did. Not violent, not dramatic, just quietly humiliating. And because this decision came from military logic, it also ignored a key question diplomats always obsess over: will this hurt us? In material terms, it won't. There are very few Americans in Mali or Burkina Faso. Tourism is negligible, trade is limited, flights are rare, so the risk was never economic. The risk was symbolic, and military governments are far more willing to gamble with symbolism than civilian ones. Because symbolism is how legitimacy is built in post-coup regimes. They survive not by prosperity, but by projecting independence. This move fits that pattern perfectly. It doesn't improve daily life. It doesn't solve security problems. It doesn't create new alliances. But it sends one clear message: we will not absorb your rules silently. Which is why the real surprise wasn't the ban itself. It was how easily the population accepted it. So why were ordinary people so emotionally aligned with a decision that technically changes nothing in their lives? They accepted it so easily because emotionally, nothing new was taken from them. For most people in Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Senegal, or the Ivory Coast, the idea of freely traveling to the United States already feels fictional. Not difficult, not complicated, fictional. The process is familiar to everyone. You collect documents for months: bank statements, employment letters, invitation letters, property papers. You pay fees that equal several months' income. You travel to another city just to attend the interview. And then you sit in front of a glass window. 3 minutes, 5 questions, a stamp, rejected, no explanation, no appeal, no feedback. Just a paper that says you are not eligible, without telling you why. People don't experience this once. They experience it repeatedly. Families save for years. Students delay education plans. Entrepreneurs cancel projects. All for a system where approval feels arbitrary and rejection feels automatic. So when Trump announced a new ban, most Africans didn't feel shocked. They felt validated. It simply confirmed what they already suspected. The border was never neutral. It was never based on individual merit. It was always based on where you were born. That's why there was no outrage when Mali and Burkina copied the ban. Because emotionally, the rejection had already happened long ago. The door was already closed. This just made it official. And that's where the psychology flips. When you still believe access is possible, every restriction feels like an attack. But once you stop believing in access, restrictions stop hurting. They become background noise. At that point, something strange happens. You stop wanting entry. You start wanting closure, not access to their world, but distance from their judgment. So when Mali and Burkina said don't come either, People didn't interpret it as isolation. They interpreted it as symmetry. Finally, the imbalance was named without speeches. Finally, rejection went both ways. Finally, the humiliation wasn't one-sided. This is why Gen Z reactions were different from those of older generations. Older generations were raised on the promise of migration, the idea that success meant leaving, the belief that Western borders were gates to a better life. Gen Z grew up watching deportations on TikTok. They saw students sent home mid-degree. They saw families split at airports. They saw refugees warehoused in camps. They saw people with perfect records still denied entry. So they no longer associate the West with opportunity. They associate it with friction. Embassies feel like courtrooms. Airports feel like interrogations. Visas feel like lotteries. And once a system feels random, people stop respecting it. They stop aspiring to it. They stop trusting it. They stop defending it. So when Mali and Burkina mirrored the ban, it didn't feel rebellious. It felt honest. It acknowledged a reality everyone already lives inside. Global movement is not a right. It's a privilege distributed unevenly. The only difference now is that, for once, the unevenness was visible from both sides. Which leads to the deeper problem no one in Washington planned for. If people stop emotionally believing in Western access, what happens to Western power when it's no longer desired? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The real shock didn't come from the policy itself. It came from the feeling it created. For the first time, the American passport entered unfamiliar territory. Not in war zones, not in hostile states, not in sanctioned countries, in two ordinary African states, with no history of anti-American travel restrictions. And nothing dramatic happened. No speeches, no border incidents, no stranded travelers on the news. Just a quiet possibility introduced into reality. Americans might be refused entry based purely on who they are. That possibility alone is what made this moment different. Because the power of the U.S. passport has never been legal. It has been psychological. It carries an assumption of belonging, the expectation that borders open, that visas are formalities, that travel is a matter of convenience, not permission. Most Americans don't even think about their nationality when they travel. They think about luggage, hotels, flights, and weather. Nationality is invisible to them, until it isn't. Mali and Burkina made nationality visible again. They introduced the same uncertainty that billions of people live with every time they approach Western borders. Will I be questioned? Will I be rejected? Will I be turned away without explanation? This is not how Americans experience the world. So when that uncertainty appeared, even symbolically, it felt out of place. Like gravity malfunctioning. Not dangerous, not catastrophic, just unsettling. And that's the point. The counterban didn't aim to harm Americans. It aimed to make them feel something they're not used to feeling. Conditional legitimacy. Not being wanted, not being expected, not being automatically trusted. This is why the move attracted global attention despite having almost no practical effect. Because it broke a deep assumption embedded in global mobility. Some passports belong everywhere, others belong nowhere. For decades, African travelers internalized this asymmetry as normal. Western travelers never had to. Now, even briefly, the asymmetry flipped. Not through protest, not through conflict, but through administrative mimicry. And that mimicry is what made people uncomfortable. Because once you see the system from the other side, you can't pretend it's neutral anymore. You realize that security screening is not just about safety, it's about sorting. That risk assessment is not just about threats, it's about identity. That immigration policy is not just about borders, it's about hierarchy. And when the U.S. passport enters that hierarchy instead of sitting above it, the entire structure becomes visible. Not as a law, but as a design. Which leads to a more dangerous realization. If the passport system is designed, not natural, then it can be redesigned. And once that thought enters political consciousness, even symbolically, power starts losing its invisibility. So if this moment exposed the hierarchy so clearly, What exactly was the hierarchy built to protect in the first place? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What this moment really exposed was something most people live inside but rarely name. There is a global ranking system, and it has nothing to do with talent, intelligence, or effort. It is built around documents, passports, visas. Nationality codes are stored in databases. Some people move first and explain later. Some people explain first and still get rejected. Some people don't even try because the outcome feels predetermined. This hierarchy decides who studies abroad and who stays local, who works internationally and who is overqualified at home, who builds global networks and who remains invisible. And the strangest part is how quietly everyone accepts it. It's never presented as a caste system. It's presented as security, as policy, as risk management. Neutral words that hide the structure underneath. Trump's ban didn't invent this hierarchy. It just made it blunt. By openly grouping dozens of countries under one vague label, it removed the polite fiction that mobility is based on individual merit. It showed what had always been true: movement is distributed by birth. Mali and Burkina didn't argue against that system. They didn't protest it. They didn't demand fairness. They applied it back. That's what made this moment dangerous for the old order. Because hierarchies survive only when they feel natural. When people believe, this is just how the world works. Some countries are trusted, others aren't. Some passports are strong, others are weak. Once that belief cracks, the system doesn't collapse immediately. But it loses legitimacy. It stops feeling like reality and starts feeling like design, something built by decisions, maintained by habits, enforced by institutions, and design invites revision. That's why this wasn't really about America. It was about visibility. For decades, African travelers experienced rejection as personal failure. Not enough money, not enough proof, not convincing enough. Now, the system itself was mirrored so cleanly that the personal explanation stopped making sense. It became obvious that rejection was structural, not individual. And once people see that, their relationship with the system changes. They stop blaming themselves. They stop aspiring to impress. They stop internalizing its standards, not loudly, not politically, psychologically. They begin to treat it as one system among many, not the ultimate gatekeeper of value. That's the real shift. Not that Mali and Burkina banned Americans, but millions of people suddenly saw the passport hierarchy as something that can be copied, flipped, and ignored. Which means its power is no longer invisible, and invisible power is the only kind that lasts. So if this hierarchy is now visible, and visibility weakens legitimacy, what happens to a global system once people stop emotionally believing in its authority? The most important change didn't happen at airports. It happened in people's heads. Nothing material shifted after the ban. Flights continued, embassies stayed quiet, no trade routes collapsed, no diplomatic crises erupted. On paper, the world looked the same, but psychologically, something subtle broke. For the first time, African states treated Western mobility rules not as sacred laws, but as adjustable tools, not moral truths, not universal standards, just policies that can be mirrored, copied, or ignored. That alone changes how power works, because systems don't survive on enforcement alone, they survive on internalization. People follow rules more effectively when they believe in them than when they're forced to obey them. For decades, African societies internalized Western mobility systems as a natural reality. Strong passports exist. Weak passports exist. That's just how life is. This moment introduced a different idea. That hierarchy is optional. Not illegal, not unjust, optional. And once a hierarchy feels optional, it loses its psychological gravity. People stop measuring their worth against it. Stop defining success by entry into it. Stop organizing their dreams around it. They begin to emotionally detach, not in rebellion, in indifference. That's far more destabilizing. Rebels still orbit the system. Indifferent people leave it behind. And this is where the deeper shift begins. African youth are no longer asking, how do we get into their world? They're starting to ask, What happens if we build our own? Not in slogans, not in manifestos, but in small, practical ways. Local startups instead of migration plans, regional trade instead of foreign visas, digital work instead of physical relocation, not because it's easier, but because the old promise of access has expired. The West used to represent escape. Now it represents friction. And friction doesn't attract ambition. It repels it. So the real impact of this ban isn't political. It's motivational. It marks the moment when Western borders stopped being aspirational and started being irrelevant. Not closed, not hostile, just unimportant. And that's the worst possible outcome for any power system. Because power depends on being desired. Once people stop wanting what you control, you can still enforce it, but it no longer defines the future. So the final question isn't whether this policy will be reversed or forgotten. The real question is, what happens to global power when the people it once excluded stop caring whether they're included at all? Let us know in the comments section. Do you support Traore's decision? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.